the Twin Cities and Iowa, and it's an indication that would work in Wisconsin, were farm shows. So the way how these sometimes work in stations, the way it worked here was several years ago, some of us were advocating we should do a farm memory show. And, you know, seen success in other stations. There's this big population in places like Wisconsin who grew up on the farm, whose parents grew up on the farm. It's their life. And so we did a farm show. We did a barn show, and we did it for Pledge, and it was terrible. I had no response. But the show itself wasn't really crafted for a Pledge show. It was a producer produced the show they wanted to, and from my perspective, when I looked at it, went, that's not what I would do for Pledge. But what we learned out of it was farm shows don't work here. But so and people are happy to sort of confirm the things that they want to believe. So to me, I'd say what we learned is that farm show didn't work. I would have said we should have taken a different approach. We should have been more collaborative with people who had the best sense of what makes Pledge shows work. So fast forward, you know, 12 years later, by the time people have forgotten that farm shows don't work in Wisconsin, we approached Jerry Apps about doing a program. And the producer at the time took this approach to build this sort of history of his farm, and it was very much a history show and not the Pledge show that I thought would work, and that sort of fell to the wayside. And then it sort of reemerged. We had done some community event with Jerry Apps, and you could just see the response of the audience. And James decided we have to do something with Jerry Apps, he's this great Wisconsin storyteller, and we need to act on this now. So signed in a producer. We collaborated with Mick Dirks, who produced it, about what that show should be, and it's going to be for Pledge. And we said we should talk about the 30s and the 40s. We should talk about growing up on the farm. This will be something that will resonate with people in Wisconsin. It'll be a memory of their life. The analogy that I like is it's sort of like a family photo album. You know, it's their story, Jerry's telling it, but they recognize their life in that story. So I remember seeing the first 4 minutes of that show and saying, yes, this is it. And then this is just, Jerry happens to tell stories this way that really resonate with people, that are his stories, but they connect with. But our producer just followed that thread and said, we want to stay in the 30s and the 40s. We want this sense of a time that's not here anymore, and to capture it both in the stories that Jerry tells and in the images, and sort of create that photo album kind of story that is the viewer's story, the present. And that the most evocative part of it were the old photos from the families, the images from catalogs, old products from the era that kept you in that time. And so when we went through looked at the rough of it, to me, I went back and said, could you change that image? Could you do this? So one example in that was the imagery in there's a scene of the 4th of July going to the park. And a lot of that imagery in that segment was current. So it took us out of the past, came to current, at the lake as it is now, and you lose that sense of you're in the 30s or you're in the 40s in your time, and now you're in the present. And so that when we went from the rough to the final show, I think there was a lot of just tweaking to try to keep the audience in that time, replacing current video with photos from the past, or photos that were, or videography that was more evocative of that time. Pictures of old barns instead of pictures of new barns. Pictures of an old farmhouse instead of just any farmhouse, to try to keep the viewer in that time. When people look at it, there's not a story arc. There's not tension. There's not a character that we're following through in a very clear way, and there's a payoff. But what we're following, it's touching something in the brains and memories of the audience. That I think one of the things that show has is we think of a show of what we see and what we hear, and in this case it's more than that. It's what's happening in the brains of the people who are watching, because they're filling in some of the arc of that story. they're looking at their spouses and they're nodding and they're saying, remember Uncle Chet's place. And so the story is much richer than what we have on screen because it's conscious of allowing the viewer to have a place in that story too. So if he's talking about 4th of July, if he's talking about the end of World War II, they are hearing his story, but they're remembering their story. So it allows them for a place in the program. So once they're in the program, once the story's their program, then once Jerry evokes these memories, and also evokes those memories as well, then the arc and narrative doesn't matter because it's their story, and they're driven through it because it's so meaningful to them, rather than the narrative things that drives us through, like tension and payoff and all those things that keep us reading books or keep us watching a movie or keep us watching a television program. They keep watching in this case, and they want to share it because it's their story and their life. Add to her class of grade schoolers year after year after year to talk about his experience. And then after we had produced our World War II documentary, and she showed them him on television in her classroom, she said the attentiveness of the kids just went way up. There's something about the power of television. There's the difference between being on the front page of the newspaper and being on page 7 in this little blurb. It affirms the importance of this. So in Trempolo at the local library, the little small rural town, not necessarily all farmers, but Jerry tells the story of he spoke to kids about farm life and everything, and they, you know, have a mixture of interest and everything like that. But he said they watched the whole documentary first, and these kids are like watching the show and they're looking and going, that's the guy, and that's the guy, and he said then, and they were just intently interested. And then when he spoke, you know, they were intently interested because this was the guy that was on television. So I think there's a, you know, television focuses on things and it tells us, I mean, rightly or wrongly, what we think is important. So if it's on television, I think that's a cue to people in some ways, like it's on the front page or the cover of Time magazine. It says this is really important, and I think television is one of those cues if something's important. So when we do programs like Hometown Stories, it's a demonstration to the communities that we work in Green Bay and Janesville, that says it's important, and it's important to our organization. So when we do concerts in, you know, Medford and Wausau and La Crosse,